this is a paper that focuses on a particular kind of disability, which is the case of remote communities in indigenous areas. This picture is a community by the Negro River of the Amazon. I'll first begin by sharing with you a broad view of Brazil. Most of the disabilities related to vision, and that points to an issue of the legislation and how one defines the different kinds of disability varies between countries, and this is something that I think points to the need of some harmonization in terms of the statistics. When we look at the statistics of the Amazon, and this is divided by different types of disabilities and different age classes, and this is the raw numbers, but the percentages is that most of it is, again, it's visual, but we have then in an order of magnitude, hearing, motor, and mental disabilities as a sequence. In terms of the age classes of rural population, which is the emphasis of what I'll be talking about, is quite well divided, less so of very early ages, like 0 to 4, and more so in the intermediate age class. So it varies a little bit among age classes. But I'd like to point out to the fact that people with disabilities face very distinct challenges in indigenous communities. And this picture illustrates a little bit of that. Snake bites can be quite different. And this requires different approaches. In the case of snake bites itself, this is an issue that has to do with the access to venom, anti-venom treatment, which is poor in remote villages compared to farms. And that means that snake bites at an early stage of life can have a big impact in children's livelihoods in terms of how they develop their sensory and social experiences and their roles in communities. So there are some, and this is just an illustration of one particularity of indigenous peoples. Another point that makes it very distinct is the fact that indigenous communities are often neglected by governments. And the reasons are very simple. They have low political weight, few votes, and they're more expensive in terms of delivering governmental services. So they tend to be neglected. And as a result of that, institutions are either absent, or when they're present, they're much weaker than compared to the realities of non-indigenous groups. So if we're talking about schools, for example, these schools are much poorer, much less equipped. They don't have well-trained staff to deliver appropriate education, to take care of those with disabilities with adequate treatment. Health agents, if we go to the health sector, also don't have adequate training to work with people with disabilities in indigenous communities. And this is compounded by the fact that there are big cultural differences between indigenous and non-indigenous societies. Some societies, some indigenous societies, have a strong prejudice against people with disabilities. And some of them, this includes murder at birth. On the other hand, indigenous peoples have a stronger safety net in a way by having collective approaches, for example, food sharing, and that can have positive benefits for people with disabilities. So the point that needs to be stressed here is that one has to take into account these very, very different cultural differences so that outside interventions pose new ethical and methodological challenges, how to get involved with a culture that is so different. On top of that, we have climate change. Now, this picture illustrates the Negro River, which dried out completely, not completely, in some parts it dried out completely. During this record drought we had this year. And indigenous peoples are very connected to nature, which is positive in many ways, but it also makes them more vulnerable, and especially in terms of logistics. And this affects, in a way, disabled people that is poorly known. So another point I'd like to make is that there is a very poor knowledge in science about what is the nature of the challenges of livelihoods of people with disability in indigenous communities. And jobs that could be done by people with disabilities in urban areas are not the same and oftentimes not available in indigenous communities that often depend on agriculture and fishing and so on. Having a more conceptual approach, if we look at who can have positive impact on indigenous peoples with disabilities, I divide it in 4 segments: governments, academia, civil society, and business. And governments have the challenge of giving low priority to this for the reasons I've mentioned. Academia is also not as engaged with this agenda because also lack this kind of support, and business don't have the know-how. New approaches are needed. This picture illustrates telemedicine using internet for training of community health agents. So we need to come up with new ways of bridging this gap and so as to promote not only adaptation to climate change, but also justice. There are many, and here I shift gears a little bit to talk about the positive things that are happening that can shed some light on ways forward. This is a program designed by the University of Amazonia, which is a very interesting program that engage different disciplines together with those that need care, that have different kinds of disabilities, and they've created an observatory, and they have developed a methodology to work with people with disability. So this is something that, in a way, could be fostered and increased, is the engagement of universities in developing different methodologies in how to do it. They developed also a sort of a platform to organize and to share experiences in health, education, and social assistance. This is a work that is done by the institution that I run, FAS, which is work with community health agents for family visits and family support at the local level. And I'd like to come to a closing to this, saying that indigenous peoples do deserve special attention, and this in a way to also compensate for the legacy of colonialism that still is present today, the exploitation and the injustice that is present. And if we look forward to all these segments and trying to come up with a positive agenda on how to face this challenge, I think there are many opportunities. I think we need to incentivize and increase the engagement of government so as to have more efficient and efficacy policies. This requires more investment, and this also requires partnerships. So I think one of the realities that I see in indigenous peoples is that we should not only rely and depend on governments, we should build a broad partnerships, including academia, that need to develop better research, education, and extension services related to this issue of disabilities in remote indigenous communities. Civil society organizations can not only become more active and harnessing more financial resources, but also be the catalyst of these multi-stakeholder partnerships. So my sense is that civil society organizations have more passion and more commitment, and that can be a driver of building these alliances that include the governments, academia, and business that can play a role in providing financial support as well. I'd like to close with two messages of Pope Francis. One about indigenous peoples. This is a picture at Pope Francis in the Amazon Synod, reinforcing the need that indigenous peoples need to maintain their roots and their culture and their identity. So we have to be very humble in the way that we approach indigenous peoples with the lens of persons with disabilities. So it cannot be a top-down process, but rather something that is done together. And finally, another message about those with disabilities, that is our duty, which is the essence of this seminar. And this is essential for us to keep hope alive for all, for maintaining the rainforest and maintaining not only forests in the tropics, but also in other parts of the world that are so essential. And I make this final message from the inspiration of the COP here in Dubai, where I'm present. I think we have a pressing issue of climate change, and we have to have this lens on people with disabilities, taking into account the fact that we are at an emergency in terms of climate change. And this climate crisis affects people in different ways, and those that are more vulnerable include disabled persons, and they require special attention in the context that we're living in. Thank you, Gustavo.